Hello, good morning. Welcome today here in the Center for Global Justice. So let's start. 71 years after the US government executed Ethel and Julius Rosenberg on charges of conspiring to steal the secret of the atomic bomb, is Ethel Rosenberg finally about to be exonerated? Robert Meeropol, the younger son of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, was 6 years old in 1953 when his parents were executed. In the 1970s, he and his brother, Michael Meeropol, successfully sued the FBI and the CIA to force the release of 300,000 previously secret documents about their parents. In 2016, in the wake of overwhelming new evidence showing that the US government knew Ethel was not a spy and executed her anyway, Robert and his brother launched a nationwide petition campaign asking President Obama to exonerate their mother. The effort garnered 60,000 petition signers and generated extensive and favorable coverage by many of the most respected and far-reaching media outlets around the US and internationally. For over 50 years, Robert Meeropol has been a progressive activist, author, and public speaker. In 1990, he founded the Rosenberg Fund for Children and served as its executive director until he retired from that position when his daughter took over the fund's leadership in 2013. Robert remains on the RFC's board of directors. So let's welcome him and listen to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Lulu, for that introduction. I am, I want to thank Bob for setting this up and organizing this with me and everybody involved in the Institute. I also want to say that 10 years ago, I gave a talk at the Biblioteca in San Miguel, and really wish I could be doing this in person instead of via Zoom from far away, but that's not to be. So we'll make the best of the situation. What I plan to do is to start with an overview of my parents' case, then focus on my mother, the evolution of my views about my parents' case, and where we are today with the Exonerate Ethel campaign. The first thing to understand in looking at an overview of my parents' case is that they were charged with conspiracy to commit espionage, as Lulu mentioned in the introduction, not treason or espionage, as is usually reported. And this is important because to prove conspiracy, the prosecution only must demonstrate that two or more people planned an illegal act and took one act in furtherance of their plan. Despite this, the public was told by all media outlets that Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were found guilty of stealing and giving the secret of the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union. So that today, it's almost always reported in the media that they were convicted of espionage or treason, even though neither is accurate. And that's important because, as often happens in conspiracy cases, the key evidence consisted entirely of spoken testimony by alleged co-conspirators. In other words, there's no physical evidence. David and Ruth Greenglass, my mother's younger brother and his wife, provided that evidence. And the Greenglasses received leniency in return for their testimony. Now, my parents, when they took the stand in the trial, denied engaging in espionage. And that's where the climate of the times. The trial took place in 1951 at the height of the McCarthy period, in the midst of the Korean War. That's where that was critical. If contradictory verbal testimony is provided, who is the jury going to believe? Credibility is the key factor here. The US government and prosecution witnesses who are family members or defendants who take the Fifth Amendment when asked if they were Communist Party members. The jury believed the government and its witnesses, and a conviction was inevitable. Over 40 years after my parents' execution, in 1995, the National Security Agency, the NSA, released materials called the Venona Files, which revealed that my father provided non-atomic information to the Soviet Union during the 1940s, but that he was, quote, ignorant of the atomic bomb project. The media ignored the latter. Further, the Greenglasses testified that at my father's direction, they gave a sketch of a cross-section of the atomic bomb to Soviet agents. But secret Soviet documents, made public much more recently, demonstrates that the Greenglasses actually did this on their own after the KGB suspended my father from active operation because they feared he'd been discovered by the FBI. Now, concerning Ethel, David Greenglass testified under oath before the grand jury, and this material was finally released to the public decades after my parents' death, that my mother wasn't involved. So he testified under oath before the grand jury Ethel Rosenberg wasn't involved, but swore at trial that she was. Ruth Greenglass did not mention any active involvement by my mother at the grand jury, but testified that neither she nor David received any espionage material from Julius in the fall of 1945. At trial, she swore the opposite. The jury was never told of these contradictions. In fact, David Greenglass stated on national television in 2001 that he lied about Ethel's involvement so he could protect his wife. Also, from the Venona files, we learned that the KGB gave all its agents code names. Julius Rosenberg and the Greenglasses had code names. Ethel was not given a code name, indicating that the KGB did not consider her their agent. The notorious Roy Cohn, who later worked for Senator McCarthy and became the young Donald Trump's mentor, was an assistant prosecutor in the case. Cohn consulted secretly with trial judge Irving R. Kaufman before and during the trial to ensure a guilty verdict. FBI documents reveal Judge Kaufman agreed to consider sentencing my parents to death before the defense began presenting their case. In sum, my father did provide information about military technology to the Soviet Union, but it was not related to the atomic bomb, and my mother was not a spy. She was only arrested, according to the FBI files, to use as a, quote, lever to force my father to cooperate. So let's focus on Ethel. I intend in the rest of my talk to prove Ethel Rosenberg, my mother, was not a spy. I'll do this within the framework of providing you with a history and analysis of my views of my parents' case and finally provide an update on the Exonerate Ethel campaign we launched in the middle of 2016, and we're still considering when the time is right to launch it once again. Let's look at the facts of my mother's case in a little bit more detail. And I want to say, I'm very fact-oriented here. I'm going into a lot of detail, and I know it's really hard to retain all this, but you need to cite facts in order to prove your case. So I am forced to do that. And in this case, the facts are somewhat limited. There are 3 points of testimony during the trial that provided testimony against my mother. The first is the government said that in November of 1944, that my mother helped my father convince Ruth Gringlas to recruit David Gringlas into the espionage ring. Now, how did this come about? Well, David Gringlas was an Army sergeant who was transferred to Los Alamos. He was a machinist. He made parts of the atomic bomb. Los Alamos was in New Mexico where the bomb was being fabricated, and he was transferred out there, and Ruth Gringlas was still in New York City while she waited to get an apartment in Albuquerque near Los Alamos so she could go out and join her husband. Ruth testified that at this meeting between her and my parents, that when she was encouraged, when Julius suggested that she recruit David, that she testified that she voiced reluctance, and that when Ruth voiced reluctance, Ethel chimed in and said, "Let David decide for himself," to encourage her. Number 2, both Gringlasses also swore that Ethel was at a meeting at the Rosenbergs' apartment on September 25th, 1945, a month after World War II ended. And she swore that David gave a cross-section sketch of the atomic bomb to Julius Rosenberg, and the prosecution called this sketch, and I'm going to quote here, "the one weapon that might hold the key to the survival of this nation." In other words, the jury was told this case was about national survival. The third bit of evidence, the Gringlasses also testified that my mother typed up David's handwritten notes that accompanied his sketch. So we have 3 things: encouragement, attendance, and typing. That is the trial evidence against my mother. Many people have a hard time believing that, but that's it. And it's not much. So you can see why I wanted to focus on my mother. How could this testimony, even if entirely true, how could that justify a death sentence? Well, but was it true? Did Ethel really say, "Let David decide for himself" at that November 1945 meeting? Well, maybe not. The KGB files report that Ruth Gringlas was enthusiastic and didn't need any encouragement. And the FBI files show that Roy Cohn, the assistant prosecutor, pressured Ruth 10 days before the trial to invent this. So Assistant Prosecutor Roy Cohn is a chief architect of my mother's death. Now, that takes care of the first claim. The second and third claims about attendance and typing have no supporting evidence in the record and are contradicted by the Gringlasses' grand jury testimony. Remember, as I said earlier, both Gringlasses failed to mention the September 25th meeting before the grand jury, let alone anything about my mother being engaged in typing. I might point out as an aside that sometimes it's easier to make something out of something else than to make something out of nothing. What I mean by that is it turned out that September 28th, 1945 would have been my mother's 30th birthday. And so it's quite possible that the Rosenbergs and the Greenglasses got together around that point to celebrate that. But the content of their meeting had nothing to do with the secret of the atomic bomb. Further, David Greenglass said on national television in 2001 that he lied about Ethel's typing at trial, that the September 1945 meeting is also further undermined by the Russian files. They show that Ruth Greenglass gave the sketch in question to a KGB agent without Ethel and Julius's involvement in December rather than September 1945. So I think the sum here, if you want to get rid of all the facts, the sum here is that September 45 meeting, which was the key evidence presented against my mother at trial, never happened. The final piece, and perhaps even more powerful than what I just said, comes from the Venona files again. And that is very simply, the KGB gave all its agents code names. Ethel was not given a code name. So we can say with complete confidence, based on that alone, that my mother was not a KGB agent. More personally, how did my views evolve to where I was willing to separate my mother's case from my father's case? Now, I grew up believing and was told by those around me that both my parents were totally innocent. And so from the period, I would say 1962, when I was a teenager and began doing some independent research into the case, until 1982, when I went to law school, I believed in the total innocence of both Ethel and Julius. That changed when I went to law school between 1982 and 1985. I realized that proving that my parents were framed is not the same as proving them innocent. That yes, we had shown the government fabricated evidence, the judge secretly communicated with the prosecution witnesses lied. All that showed was that there was a frame-up. But that didn't necessarily prove my parents' innocence. And I think lay people sometimes have a hard time with this concept of showing that's the difference between showing there being insufficient evidence to prove someone guilty and proving that they're totally innocent. And I'll give you because the reality is, as strange as it may seem, it's possible to frame guilty people. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think the best example I can give of this, and I think since most of the people here in on this program are older, they'll remember the O.J. Simpson case. That was a case in which the Los Angeles Police Department attempted to frame O.J. Simpson by introducing gloves into evidence that he supposedly wore. And when the defense showed that the gloves didn't fit him, it created reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors, and so he was acquitted. But I believe that O.J. Simpson really was guilty, but that the prosecution tried to frame him, and in the process that exposed their efforts, created reasonable doubt, and so the jury was actually correct in acquitting him, even though he was guilty. That's what I mean when I say it's possible to frame guilty people. But I'm not claiming that my parents were guilty. starting around 1990, new evidence from the collapsed Soviet Union, I saw that the evidence pointed to my father's involvement in non-atomic espionage, but the same evidence did not implicate my mother. And as a new lawyer, just graduated from law school a few years earlier, I looked at this and said, we need to separate Ethel's case from Julius's case. But I didn't make much progress. And a lot of that was because the people I were working with, the people who had worked to save my parents' lives, many of them had become what I call true believers. It was an all or nothing situation. My parents were either totally innocent or they didn't want to be involved. The reality is that my father was not guilty of what he was killed for, but he was involved in illegal activity, and my mother wasn't. And that got lost in the shuffle. And I was frustrated because I wanted to separate these two groups, but I didn't really have any support for doing that. 2008 began the big change. That's when Ruth Gringlass's grand jury testimony was released after her death in 2007. Now, to reiterate, Ruth made no mention of the evidence against Ethel that she gave at trial during the grand jury. And so when this was released, there was nothing about the September 1944 meeting or typing or notes or anything, and it showed that she lied at trial when she said that she got nothing from the Rosenbergs in the fall of 1945. This material, released in 2008, caused some of the mainstream media for the first time to begin to say, well, is it possible that Ethel was collateral damage, that she wasn't really guilty? A few questions were raised, but then the news faded. And it wasn't until 2012, as I was contemplating this, that I realized I had an opening to really focus on my mother in a public way. One, I had convinced enough of the true believers by that point that we could separate Ethel and Julius. And two, I realized that, as I mentioned earlier, that September 28th was my mother's birthday, and that September 28th, 2015 would have been my mother's 100th birthday. And so I began work, what turned out to be years of work, on New York City Council members, trying to get them to issue a proclamation declaring Ethel's execution wrongful. That progressed, but we also had some luck around that time. In July of 2015, David Gringlass's grand jury testimony was finally released because he'd died the year before. And David stated that Ethel was not involved. Explicitly, he stated that. This was unexpected. We expected David's testimony to be vaguer and to echo Ruth's, but instead he explicitly stated Ethel Rosenberg was not involved. And there's two benefits that we received from this. It now showed that both David and Ruth Gringlass contradicted their sworn trial testimony in sworn grand jury statements without giving any explanation of their change in testimony. So we had now proven, and this is the most important thing, that both of them had perjured themselves. And the jury never knew of their perjury in a case which was a conspiracy case where all the testimony was verbal and credibility of the witnesses was key, and the Gringlasses were the only witnesses against my mother. Well, based upon all this, the New York Times became interested in us writing an op-ed piece about this, which was published in August of 2015, in which we called on Obama to act before he left office in January of 2017 in order to exonerate my mother. This also juiced up interest in the New York City Council in the proclamation that we'd been working on, got more members to sign on, and the Manhattan Borough president became involved, and she ended up declaring September 28th, 2015, the Ethel Rosenberg Day of Justice in Manhattan. All of this further interested CBS, the 60 Minutes program. We first talked to them in the fall of 2015. It was ultimately, they broadcasted a double episode on our efforts in October of 2016. And you can still go on YouTube and probably find that. The interviewer is Anderson Cooper. And that was part of our big push in the fall of 2016. But I first want you to understand what we were asking for, because people frequently misstate. We were not asking for a pardon, because you pardon guilty people, and we were claiming that Ethel wasn't guilty. We were also not asking for clemency, because you can't grant clemency to someone who's already been executed. What we were asking for is we wanted Obama, before he left office, to issue a proclamation declaring Ethel's conviction and execution wrongful. And if he did that, we'd consider Ethel exonerated. So I want to say that we were not asking Obama to declare Ethel Rosenberg innocent. And as I've said before, lay people sometimes have a difficult time understanding the difference between not guilty or wrongfully convicted and declaring someone innocent. And in the case of a conspiracy case, like my parents, how can I or anyone prove that Ethel Rosenberg never took an action with her husband that furthered the conspiracy in one way or another? It was impossible. It's almost impossible to prove a negative. So we weren't asking for a declaration of innocence, because we know that would be, we couldn't get that far, even though we believed her to be innocent. Instead, we were asking for her conviction to be declared wrongful and her execution to be declared wrongful, and we would consider that an exoneration. So, if our case is so strong, why didn't Obama respond? Because he didn't. He didn't turn us down before leaving office. He just didn't do anything. Well, I think there were two reasons. And of course, since I can't get inside Obama's head, I'm not certain of them. But one is, I think the Obama White House really panicked when Trump won the election. They were totally shocked. And they had bigger fish to fry than dealing with our request. Secondly, I think because our request was not asking for a pardon or not asking for clemency, it was not unprecedented, but it was somewhat unusual. And that made it more complicated. There's a pardon attorney in the president's office. There's a procedure you use to go through for clemency. There was no such set procedure for issuing a proclamation about Ethel's exoneration. So I think those two things worked together, and nothing happened in 2017. Well, given that Roy Cohn was Donald Trump's mentor, and Roy Cohn was one of the main architects of my mother's execution, we knew that asking Donald Trump to exonerate Ethel was like Don Quixote tilting at windmills. And so we didn't do anything, but when the 4-year Trump nightmare ended, we planned to approach Biden about this. But what was the right time? Who was going to pay attention at the height of the COVID epidemic? Who was going to pay attention after the January 6th attempted coup? So we waited, and then Russia invaded Ukraine. And then we realized that we had increased headwinds. How could we get a Democratic president to exonerate someone who was convicted of spying for the Russians when the Democrats were the principals supporting a war, a proxy war against Russia, when Russia had once again become our chief enemy? Well, we kind of racked our brains about this. How can we, we've got such a strong case, but the political winds are against us, and what can we do? Well, we knew that we needed to strengthen our already strong case if we had any chance of making any progress. So my brother and I filed a Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, administrative request of the National Security Agency in July of 2022, as was said in the introduction. Now, I have to step back and give you a little history of this. Back in the 1970s, my brother and I, 50 years ago, filed our first Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. We asked 18 different government agencies to produce what was eventually 300,000 previously secret files, but we didn't realize that the NSA was involved, and we didn't ask them for anything because we didn't know to ask them. When the NSA released the Venona transcripts in 1995, we were surprised that they were involved. And they released all these transcripts of decrypted communications between Russian agents in the United States and in the Soviet Union, but not materials related to the transcripts, except for one tantalizing memo written by the chief decryptor, whose name was Meredith Gardner. And Meredith Gardner wrote a memo that we received in 1995 about my mother that appeared to be a fragmentary memo that addressed the issue: what does it mean in the Venona transcripts that Ethel Rosenberg does not work? Well, he theorized that it meant that she didn't do espionage work. But it was kind of a tentative conclusion. But it was still, when you put that up against the KGB not giving my mother a code name, it really tantalized us. But we thought, because they had released this whole booklet of material, and I can show you the book is about this thick, we thought they'd given us everything. And so we did not think beyond that. But as we're racking our brains trying to figure out how to strengthen our case in 2022 and 2021, we realized that there must be more. There couldn't just be this one fragmentary memo. And we also realized that if the NSA released all this material in 1995 and they were still sitting on some, why were they sitting on some? It must be because the material they released mostly was proving that Julius Rosenberg was involved in espionage. We figured that the stuff they didn't release was going to be exculpatory stuff that would benefit our side rather than the government's position. And why did we think it would be exculpatory? Well, as we thought about this a couple of years ago, you know, the image that I have to try to explain to people why we feel this way so strongly is, if any of you have ever put together a jigsaw puzzle, which I'm sure most of you have, you know that the more pieces you put together, the more you realize what the size, the shape, and the content of the remaining pieces are going to be. And we already knew that David and Ruth Greenglass's, the only evidence against my mother was perjured testimony. We already knew that Roy Cohn had intervened in the process to get Ruth Greenglass to make her statements. We already knew that Judge Kaufman and the prosecution were collaborating with each other. We already knew that the KGB did not give my mother a code name, and we already knew that the NSA's chief decryptor theorized that she didn't engage in espionage work. When we put all this together, we said the missing pieces are obvious. There's got to be more memos, probably by Meredith Gardner. They're going to be more conclusively reach an opinion or a conclusion that Ethel Rosenberg was not a spy. So, armed with this understanding, we only asked in July of 2022, when we asked for when we made our new administrative request of the NSA, we only asked for files written by Meredith Gardner about Ethel Rosenberg and code names. And at first, as expected, we got the bureaucratic runaround. We were told that there could be up to 500,000 pages contained in 200 boxes at the National Archives that would take years just to review. Well, we didn't have years. We've been doing this for 50 years. I'm 77, my brother's 81. At this point, we're running out of time. So we didn't accept that answer. And our lawyer was persistent and knowledgeable. And in the spring of this year, he got them to admit that there are only 88 documents that are covered by our request, and they are possessed not at the National Archive, but still in the control of the NSA directly. And my lawyer was further told, perhaps this person shouldn't have said as much as they did, that there was inside and outside pressure to release these 74-year-old documents about Ethel. And that turned out to be propitious timing on our part, because Avril Lavigne, the head of the NSA, had made this big thing about making the NSA more open, and there was this big push to declassify what was really ancient materials. So we've also been working with senators and congressmen to increase the pressure on the NSA to declassify and release this material. But that's still a work in progress. And for me personally, it's frustrating to deal with bureaucratic foot dragging. You know, we filed this request basically 2 years ago. And they say, oh, yes, 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 but nothing comes out. And this is particularly frustrating when we firmly believe that the NSA has a document in its possession that concludes Ethel Rosenberg was not a spy. So in summary, the KGB and the NSA appear to agree that Ethel was not a spy. The Greenglasses lied about Ethel being involved. The FBI lever files show why the government wanted to involve Ethel. Rarely, if ever, has there been such powerful proof that a person executed. In fact, I think never, because the United States government has never admitted that it wrongfully executed anyone. I think never have there been such a powerful case to show a wrongful conviction and execution. So that is my conclusion. And of course, it leads to the question, what can we do now? Well, there are a couple of things we can do now. First, if anybody who's interested in learning more about my mother, I hope that all of this can be seen on screen. This is the biography of Ethel that was published a couple of years ago by Ann Seba. I think it is excellent and I recommend it. And anybody who's interested, it is Ann Seba, S-E-B-B-A, Ethel Rosenberg, An American Tragedy, and published also, just like my memoir, by St. Martin's Press. So you can do that. And then secondly, since we are trying to increase the pressure on the NSA to release this material, anybody who wants to can write a letter to either your senator or your congressperson asking the NSA to declassify and release the Ethel Rosenberg documents. And, you know, Bob is going to put, I think, a picture of a template of a letter, which if any of you grab a screenshot of it, you can read the contents of the letter, and that's what I'm suggesting you say in that letter.
Okay, so I'm going to share that.
Yes.
I'm going to share that letter while I can. It did have a note that said host has disabled. Oh, there we go. Things are better. All right, we're going to share. And I want to make sure I get the share sound. Okay, so I will move our people out of the way, and you can see the text.
Yeah, yeah. And you can see it's a pretty simple letter. If you know, I would suggest taking a screenshot rather than trying to actually copy it. But if it, you know, I'll leave
people
it
could take a photo of their screens or take a photo of the screen in the hotel where the event is being originated.
Okay, I think, you know, as we you can screen share this for a few minutes longer and then, or a few seconds longer, but I'm happy to take questions from anybody when that is set up. I know that long Zooms are, you know, they can get people antsy, but I think question and answer period wake people up. But of course, we have a relatively small group here, so I'm not sure there are going to be that many questions, but I am here to answer whatever you have.
I have one.
Sure.
Does if the contradiction between the grand jury testimony and the trial testimony, was that evident to defense counsel? And if it was, is there a question as to the competence of the defense counsel?
No, it wasn't available to the defense. It turns out that it wasn't until, I don't remember whether it was the 1960s or the 1970s, that the Supreme Court ruled that if there was contradictory testimony, you had to tell the jury about it. So my parents' case, which happened in 1951, the prosecution was not obligated to do so, and they didn't. So the defense never knew what the green glasses said before the grand jury. I mean, it's kind of incredible that you could have that, because again, the power of this is that it's sworn testimony transcribed simultaneously, and that, you know, they say one thing, They swear one thing and then they swear the opposite. And you know, there are times when people make mistakes or their memory gets changed, and you can ask for an explanation of the change. But there was no explanation of the change at all. And so the jury never heard it. And that's one of the changes that, you know, has occurred in the law to make things better. Bad as things can be, at least that kind of problem doesn't exist anymore. Though, of course, in our increasingly conservative court system, something called FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Act, where terrorism is involved, there actually is allowed to be secret evidence given, which is never presented to the defense. And of course, the explanation of that is that's because we don't want to reveal things we know about terrorists. So, you know, a portion of our judiciary, our judicial system, and now allows some of these things to happen. But this kind of situation is not allowed. I'll ask myself a question because I feel like it might be that people are sitting here and wondering, you know, I make this talk at a very tumultuous political time, right? Oh, Biden, you know, Biden has just dropped out of the race. We face the storm clouds of fascism on the horizon. This case is 75 years old. Someone can legitimately ask, you know, why is this important? Why should I care about this now? Well, I think it's particularly important to care about this now because my mother's wrongful execution is a potent human rights object lesson. Our government engineered a conviction and execution based upon false evidence. That perversion of the judicial process poses a threat to anyone the government decides to prosecute. Today, the fascist seeking power will encourage law enforcement agencies to utilize our courts as vehicles of political repression and override all the protections of the Constitution and its amendments. And as we have seen since my parents' case in the 1950s, once government misconduct is justified, even torture becomes acceptable. This is a mortal threat to the fabric of civil society. Highlighting this today is one way to fight fascism tomorrow. So that's why I say the Rosenberg case may be 75 years old, but it might as well have been yesterday.
Are there other questions either in the room or online? Lulu, are you able to chime in at this point?
Yes, I would like to ask the audience online if they have any questions. No? Okay. Yes, please raise your hands to raise a question, the people on Zoom.
Well, you know,
Okay, so I'd like to make a comment. I think this is very important. Although it's been a long time, I think it's important for all of us that are always concerned with the human for everyone. So I think in the US, since it happened there, I think that there should be more participation in society. So this case has a better ending. I think it's not for me as a woman. I think it's not fair when a woman goes to jail and she has to go through all of this process, and she's an innocent person.
Yeah, but wait till
So
she's finished.
I think there should be more pressure. I don't know, the feminists in the US, the feminists, I would like to ask them to put more pressure on the government because they did wrong, and they have to change this. That's my point of view.
Yeah, well, I think Lulu, that the feminist perspective on this is really important, because if you look at my mother's case, it's like she was disappeared. That people talk about the Rosenberg case, and they talk about what the Rosenbergs did, and you ask them what Ethel Rosenberg did, and they don't know. They only know about what Julius did. And so it's like she was disappeared. In fact,
Wait,
she didn't even have a separate representation at trial. And so there are real questions about this and about the use of my mother to basically extort cooperation. And so I think you're right that that is an appropriate focus of anybody who wants to, but I want to emphasize right now, what we're really focused on is getting this material out in the public, because if we're right, if I'm right, if there is actually a memo that says by the chief decryptor of the NSA that says Ethel Rosenberg was not a spy, that's blockbuster news, especially given that the government must have known this for the last 75 years and kept it a secret. Yeah, I see someone raising your hand there, but they have to unmute. Have to unmute yourself to ask the question.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi. I missed. I've been following the case for years, but I missed something that you said, and I was wondering if you could repeat it. I missed your piece about Ruth Greenglass. I always assumed that David Greenglass was kind of the culprit and that his testimony was perjured. You had mentioned that Ruth Greenglass's testimony was also perjured. Now, what did she actually say? I kind of missed that.
What she said was she testified that when my father tried to recruit David into the spy ring, David was in New Mexico,
Right.
and Ruth was back in New York City still. She hadn't moved out there yet. And when she testified that when Julius said you should recruit David, that she voiced reluctance, that she didn't want to do it. Okay. And that Ethel then piped up and said, let David decide for himself. The Russian files indicate that Ruth Greenglass was enthusiastically responsive. She wasn't reluctant. And that showed that her trial testimony was quite possibly perjured. But the actual perjury, that was the contradiction between trial testimony and what was in the Russian files. If you want to look for the perjury, you have to go in a slightly different direction. Before the grand jury, when Ruth Greenglass was questioned, she was questioned about Ethel by the prosecutor frequently, but it was all about whether Ethel was present. And Ruth testified a couple of times that she was present or that she wasn't present. But the prosecutor asked Ruth Gringlas point blank, did you get any material? Did David get any more material from Julius Rosenberg in the fall of 1945? And she said no. She swore there was no more material given in the fall of 1945. And at the trial, she testified that more material was turned over on September 25th, 1945. So she perjured herself, because one case she said no, and the other time she said yes. And yes, as I've said before, you can contradict yourself and explain that. And that's not necessarily perjury. But if you contradict yourself without explanation, that's perjury. So that's that. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, you have an excellent, I think it's in your book, where there's an excellent diagram of this very primitive, what looked like something from the atomic bomb.
Yep.
It really, it's just really sheds a lot of light on this case, that little diagram that was brought into court.
Yeah, it actually looks like a pie.
That's right.
Slices cut out of it. It looks like an apple pie or something. And it says, over it says A bomb.
Right.
And not to scale. And it's actually, that diagram was actually impounded so as not to damage our national security. Shows how ridiculous.
Was that done by David Gringlas?
Yes, that was done by, yes, and the prosecution never claimed. Remember, I said there was no physical evidence. The prosecution never, and this is a bit of physical evidence, but the prosecutor never claimed that this was the sketch from 1945. No, this trial was taking place in 1950. David Gringlas testified that he drew the sketch from memory in his cell just before the trial. So it really wasn't evidence of what happened in 1945. It was evidence of what David Gringlas drew a few days earlier. So that was absurd. And we then ultimately took, when these diagrams were released to the public in the 1970s, in response to our Freedom of Information Act, that's when we took it to top atomic scientists who were still alive at that time. And they looked at it and they said, this is a baby drawing. This is ridiculous. One scientist, a guy named Philip Morrison, who was at Los Alamos, said to me, he said, it's like somebody drew an outline of a car, like this, and put the wheels at the bottom, and then labeled the front engine, and then said, okay, build a car.
Yeah,
it doesn't tell you anything.
Any other questions on Zoom?
Well, I want to thank everybody for attending. I hope that those who had a chance to look at this letter will take action. But also, I want to say that one of the things that we didn't talk about was the Rosenberg Fund for Children. And you may hear a cat meowing in the background. I have my ancient 17-year-old cat is now about to photobomb us. Go away. In any event, I urge you to check out the Rosenberg Fund for Children, which provides for the educational and emotional needs of the children of targeted activists. And also, if you want to learn more about the RFC, it's real easy to go to their website, which is a very simple address, www.rfc.org. So I want, before leaving, to say a few words about that. And I thank you all for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here and for sharing with us this experience with your family. Bob, would you like to say something else?
No, I saw the development of this, and I felt I was seeing it in real time when I read the book when it came out, and it's great to see that it's developed a lot farther. And I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I can share and stay on for anybody that wants to see that letter again, and keep it up for a couple of minutes.
Okay, and I will say goodbye to everybody and thank you. If you need any further information from me, Bob, just you've got my email.
All right.
Thank you all.